Welcome everyone, thanks for joining us. As Marshall said, my name is Joel. I'm a member of the Stanford Complexity Group. Many of you have attended talks in the past. There's some familiar faces in the audience, so you guys know what we're about. But for everybody else that's new, I just wanted to read you guys our mission. So our official mission statement is to serve as an interdisciplinary forum for a discussion of the findings, tools, and philosophical and cultural implications associated with the study of complex systems. And one way we accomplish this goal is by inviting speakers like Geoffrey West to give talks to the Stanford community about their research. And just in general, going with that goal, I can hardly think of a more excellent speaker to elucidate the exciting world of complex systems than Dr. Geoffrey West. Dr. West is a physicist, and in reading through the titles of some of his early papers, you would have no doubt of that fact. For example, the phenomenological model of the electromagnetic structure of the proton is an early one. However, later in his career, Dr. West took a step outside of the traditional confines of physics and began looking at seemingly unrelated phenomena through the lens of scaling laws. Where most of us would see trees, Dr. West sees a forest. And his unique perspective and extraordinary insight have led to a much deeper understanding of many complex systems. Over the past decade, for example, Dr. West has written papers on metabolism and ontogenetic growth, allometric scaling laws in biology, cancerous tumors, aging and mortality, the growth and structure of cities and companies, the structure of dynamics of forests, and sleep. A true interdisciplinarian indeed. Today his talk is titled A Unifying Framework for the Dynamics and Structure of Organisms, Ecosystems, Cities, and Companies, from Metabolism, Growth, and Mortality to Cancer and Sleep. So hold on to your seats, folks, because I think we're all for an interesting intellectual ride. But before you do, please put your hands together to help me introduce Dr. Geoffrey West.
Thanks for that introduction. I don't know quite how to handle it. But I'm in a funny situation because when I was invited by Joel to give this talk, I reminded him, but he reminded me as well. Actually, in the last 18 months, I've taught 4 times at Stanford in all 4 different departments. And I said, you know, I don't know what else I can talk about that would be different. And I would be embarrassed to give the same old talk over again. We discussed how to do that a little bit. And so what I've done is I've kind of put a whole bunch of things together, and I'm not sure it's going to be very successful. It is shuffling things around, and those that may have heard me talk at some venue here will see some slides that you've seen before, if you care to remember. But I do warn you that it's going to be a very broad spectrum, and that means that many things I'm going to really slough over and be quite superficial with. Other things I will dig a little deeper, but I'm obviously open to questions and discussion afterwards, and I'm here tomorrow if anyone wants to pursue anything further. The other thing I realized is I didn't know who this audience is. That is, I don't know what the technical background is and so forth. And so I've kind of mixed it up with a bunch of qualitative bullshit and a bunch of pseudo-mathematics and simple calculations. And we're kind of playing by ear, and some things I will skip over, and so please bear with me. And that explains this pretentious title, because I had to invent something that allowed me to talk about anything, basically. And so here it is, and it kind of divides itself into 2 pieces, actually, and that is there's a kind of biological piece, which is collaboration among all these wonderful people, most of whom were junior people when they started and had all kinds of jobs elsewhere. and some are physicists, and some are biologists, and so forth, some are chemists, and ecologists, and so on. And there's that part, and then there's another collaboration, which is loosely connected to this, which is this bunch. And again, there are some senior people down here who did none of the work, and these junior people have, and in fact, the top collaborator with respect to has, I believe, I'm told, the cover of Science this week on work that we've been doing together, but it's his paper, and if you look at Science, if you bother to read Science, you'll see his paper, and I will touch on some of the things in that later on. But this is to do with the social aspects, to do with cities and companies and the things that were loosely alluded to by Joel in the introduction. Okay, so I am a physicist, even though I work on these things that are considered canonically as outside of physics. I actually consider them physics. But I come to it with very much a physicist kind of canon, namely I'm interested in underlying laws and principles that can be put into, I'll use the word mathematical, but computational, quantitative framework. And one of the things that underlies a lot of this work that I actually realized I put together, I won't be spending enough time on, is the tension between energy and resources, kind of metabolism in the biological language, and information, genomics maybe in the biological language, but information which has traditionally been thought of until relatively recently is not integral to much of physics. But the tension between these that plays itself out, of course, in biology and in particular in the social sciences, and I will try to touch back on that later in the talk. And I'm dealing with problems that are very much collective phenomena, and they're very much at a big scale, and much of the work that I'm involved in is, as is implied in what I put here, a coarse-grained kind of view, what are the kind of average properties, and very much a big picture kind of framework to ask about the generic quantitative properties of many of these systems that can be used, one would hope, to form a basis for going deeper into some of these issues, and some of which I will touch on in this. So the overarching framework of this work is really to recognize that for much of life, much of biological systems and for social systems, scalability plays a very important role, because these systems have to be resilient, they have to be adaptable, they have to evolve, and they have to grow, and kind of implicit in that is an idea that these systems have to be scalable in some way. And just to give a trivial, well, it's not trivial, it's very profound, in fact, but a simple example maybe is who we are, namely that you could consider, of course, all of these, including us as mammals, as scaled versions of each other, despite the fact that we look quite different. We found different ecological niches, we have different detailed ecological evolutionary histories. Nevertheless, we have much in common, and indeed one of the things I would stress throughout this is that these are in fact highly scalable systems, and that to 80–90% they are in fact mathematically scaled versions of one another in almost everything to do with their physiology and life history. And one can extend that all the way across the whole spectrum of what we think of as adaptive evolving systems, beginning with the molecular level. This is just a cartoon of the chemicals involved in the production of ATP, your currency of energy. And the point is that you have a lot of those little engines, about 500 or so, roughly, inside each mitochondrion. And of course, all those have to act in an integrated, coherent way, so that a mitochondrion could be resilient over the lifetime of a cell. But those mitochondria have to come together to act in a coherent way, so that they can provide a coherence and a resilience and, in fact, an adaptability of cells. Cells, 10 to the 14th of those get together to make macroscopic, multicellular organisms, and those organisms have to act in an extraordinarily coherent way to produce things like this, and so on. So there's this extraordinary hierarchy of systems embedded in systems, and this goes on for eons. This goes on, of course, this phenomenon has gone on for several billion years now. Maybe this has only been going on for a few hundred or a few thousand maybe. Nevertheless, there is this kind of resilience, and so one could speculate that for this to remain in such a kind of metastable state, even though it's evolving, laws have to emerge at each level to govern. It's not arbitrary. Somehow there's emergent laws at each level, and that's what I consider the process of what I'm going to try to take us through is about, is trying to understand what some of those constraints are. That's not a proof of anything, that's just a speculation. And but the idea is that the things that we can see quantitatively are expressed through scaling laws, and the most fundamental, which was discovered 70, 80 years ago, so-called Kleiber's law, is about, from a physicist's viewpoint, maybe the most fundamental quantity in maybe any complex system, but particularly in biology, is metabolic rate. How much energy does the system need per second to be sustained? So here it is for a bunch of animals versus their weight, their mass, and it's plotted on log-log scale, and what you see is this kind of amazing simple scaling. That is, despite the fact that every one of these organisms, every subsystem, every cell type, every genome has evolved with its own unique history, everything is historically contingent. Nevertheless, and we're dealing with a process that's maybe the most complicated in the universe for all we know. Nevertheless, in terms of its scaling, there's something ridiculously simple about the way all these line up on a straight line on a log-log plot, meaning that there's a very simple power law relationship between metabolic rate and body mass. So that's the first thing, because if you had a totally naive view of natural selection for all these things, you would see them scattered all over this plot, which would be indicative of the total dominance of the uniqueness of every one of these animals, every subsystem of it, and so on. Nevertheless, they all line up on this simple straight line. Furthermore, this straight line is a slope less than 1. If it could have been 1, everything would have been linear, meaning that you double the size, you double the metabolic rate, which I suppose at the most naive level, again, you might have expected, double the number of cells, double the amount of energy you need. That's not the case. The slope of this is very close to a number about 0.75, which is less than 1, which means there's an economy of scale as you get bigger, meaning that the bigger you get, you need less energy per gram of tissue to be sustained. So there's all kinds of interesting things that are invoked by this very simple graph. And in fact, not long after that was discovered, it was looked at across many different taxonomic groups. And here's an old graph from 60 years ago, almost 50 years ago, showing that you see the same phenomenon being repeated across different groups with the same kind of slope, meaning that you have this very simple power law, which I've written up there, which you have this mass at 3/4, and with some colleagues, we extended it down even to the cellular level, and that's what these points are, all the way down to this so-called respiratory complex, which are the molecules that produce your ATP. And this line, incidentally, is just drawn in to be 3/4. It's just the same thing going all the way down. So there's this amazing constraint that seems to persist across much of life, even so to things that are completely different kinds of systems, like plants. And a similar thing, there's the best fit, is the regression fit is very close again to the 3/4. So here's what I said, that you might have naively expected linear, you see the 3/4, therefore the metabolic rate per unit mass decreases with size, and therefore on the average, each cells in bigger animals are working less hard in a systematic way governed by the size of the animal of which it is part. So it's a very simple law, and what is kind of amazing is that not only is this across all taxonomic groups, it's across any physiological variable. So here's a mundane one, the radius of the aorta, and that scales with a slope approximately 3/8, and it's the same for tree trunks. It's kind of amusing. And here's heart rate decreasing as mass to the 1/4. The slope of this line is very close to 1/4. And there's white matter to gray matter in the brain. This involves something to do not just with energy, but with information. This is white matter to gray matter in the brain. And what you see is a beautiful straight line on this log path with a slope close to 5/4. And here's one with much more noise in it. And this is genome length versus size of the cell. And what you see is a slope, a best fit slope, very close to 1/4. So what you're seeing is this kind of repetition of these very simple scaling laws, and what you also see is the ubiquity of this number 1/4 occurring. And here is something that I want to talk about a little more later, and you can see much more noise in the class of junk around. But I should just say a tangential remark, editorial comment. I am the last non-believer in statistics. But everybody around me and all my colleagues believe vehemently in statistics, and there are no doubt maybe the statisticians in the audience. But so if you believe the statistical fits have meaning, here they are, and what you see is that lifespan, this is lifespan versus mass, are also close to this 1/4. Birds are a little bit off, but you see there's huge variance in this. So R squares are not fantastic, but they're not terrible. But I will come back to this later. But you see much more variance, meaning that obviously in terms of whatever the constraint is, lifespan, when it comes to longevity, this is less important than the detailed physiology that we showed a moment ago. And I could show you maybe 50 more of these, but I just want to make a couple of points because I will come back to this. So this is very close to this 1/4, and I showed that heart rate goes as mass to the minus 1/4. Therefore, multiplying them together, you get the number of heartbeats in a lifetime, and that number is an approximate invariant, which is just over a billion. And so this is something that is true across, say, all mammals. Little animals don't live very long. But their hearts beat very fast in such a way they have roughly the same number of heartbeats as a great big whale. And there's just some numbers. I'm not going to belabor the point, except to say there's nothing fundamental about heartbeats, but there is about the number of times the reaction takes place producing entropy, because that transcends the specific design, and that number is an invariant. There seems to be a given number. It's like, it's the analog to the biblical 310 or something. There's some number that is to do with lifespan, and I will come back to this later and discuss that, because what I wanted to do, what I was saying earlier, I want to talk about some things I haven't talked about at my various recent trips to Stanford. This stuff I have talked about. So here's a summary of this. We have these extraordinary scaling laws that have this kind of universality in terms of not only their structure, they're these simple mathematical power laws, but they have an exponent which is very close typically to 1/4. And the question is, where do they come from? And the work that I have been involved in with some of the colleagues I showed earlier, it was to ask the question, what is it that is transcendent across completely different evolved designs? How come that trees and plants and fish and birds and mammals, even cells, seem to have this similar structure? Well, the idea was that the thing that is common among them is that all of them are complex adaptive systems which are functioning by networks in terms of information and energy being that is sustaining them, and they're typically fractal-like, and I won't talk much about that, but the idea is that it is the mathematical properties, generic properties of networks that somehow transcends design. So just to, and the kinds of properties of networks, I'll show you some pictures in a minute, the kinds of properties and the kinds of ideas that we asked that these networks should satisfy are ones that have to be independent, of course, of design. So they're things like that they are space-filling. That is, the networks have to go everywhere, and I will elaborate on that in a minute. That is, every cell in your body, for example, needs to be supported by say, the circuitry system. The second thing was that the terminal unit of the network is an invariant, so that as different species evolve within a different design, that the fundamental units, which I identify as the endpoints of the network, whether they're capillaries or cells or mitochondria, are roughly speaking invariant. That is, natural selection does not kind of reinvent the fundamental unit every time a new species evolves. It builds on those, and it does it in this language by changing the network. So the fundamental units remain the same, but the network changes. And the last thing, which is the most, the biggest assumption, and the one where physics can come in and it can be mathematized, is the idea, which is a very strong assumption, that of the infinitude of networks that are space-filling and have these invariants to their terminal units, the ones that have evolved have optimized something. In particular, have, in the kinds of things I'm going to actually show you, have minimized, for example, energy dissipated. So, for example, the circuitry system that we all possess as mammals, for example, are ones that have minimized the amount of energy your heart has to do to pump blood through the system to feed cells. It minimizes that so you can maximize the amount of energy you can put into sex and reproduction. So it maximizes some idea of Darwinian fitness. So that's the idea, and the idea is to put that into equations. And I just show you, first of all, the kinds of networks that you might think about. This is the one we're most familiar with. And there it is going to your head, but there's the brain itself. That is white to gray matter. There's your lungs, there's trees, there's a little thing that happens to be a parasite of elephants. There's networks within cells, mitochondrial, microtubule networks. There's networks within mitochondria, and the idea is that all of these are somehow variants, mathematically, of the same fundamental kinds of structures. So I want to just take you through extremely quickly one example of it, and then lead you into some applications of it. So here is a total abstraction, a kind of theoretical physicist total abstraction of such a hierarchical network, and you could think of it as a tree, literally, or as your circuitry system or one of these other systems I've talked about. And if it's the circuitry system, blood comes in and the aorta and goes out at the capillaries, then returns, of course. But the metabolic rate is basically the flow rate in through this network because it's what carries the oxygen. And so the first thing is to recognize the metabolic rate, as I've written up there, is the flow rate at Q sub 0, but also that obviously what goes in must come out, so the flow rate through the aorta, which I call Q naught in the middle, is just the number of capillaries times the flow rate through each capillary. And I've simplified this enormously, assuming all capillaries are the same, etc., etc. You can add lots of bells and whistles to this, and sum over all kinds of subsets and so on. But I just want to give you the overall sense of this. In this, by assumption, this Q sub C, what's happening in the capillary is an invariant, doesn't change with size. So as scales the number of capillaries, so scales the metabolic rate, which is surprising because if, as I'm going to show you how you derive it from this, but if the metabolic rate scales as mass to the 3/4, the number of capillaries must scale as mass to the 3/4, not linearly with the number of cells. So there's a mismatch between cells and capillaries, which, as you will see when I come to it, which has a profound implication for growth and for death. And I will show you that as we go through this, which I've written down here. Okay, so that's important. And this is typical. So the first thing is, I don't have time to go through any of the niceties, but I do want to show you just some of the mathematical results of some of the ideas. The first thing is space filling, and space filling means that the first idea is that the endpoint of the network ends near a cell. Okay, so you can imagine dividing the organism into literally cells or little cubes to which at least one capillary has to enter. But the idea of space filling mathematically is that that's true at any resolution. So you make a very coarse resolution where you can't even see the capillaries, but nevertheless it has to end in some little pixel which you divided the whole organism into. And if you take that mathematical idea of space filling, then it leads to the following, that if there's a hierarchical network whose levels are denoted by that symbol K, then the ratio between one length at one level to the next level is given by 1 over the so-called branching ratio, that is, how many tubes, if you have a tube coming in, how many tubes come from it, that's n, there's n daughters to each mother, then it has to obey this rule, and this rule is like a fractal, and you can therefore relate it all the way down to the invariant length, which is L sub n, by that mathematical formula in that box. The details of this doesn't matter. What is important is that it is governed by this parameter b that you see up there, which, because it's filling a space with a certain dimension, turns out to be 1 over the dimension of space you fill, which is in 3 dimensions, which we live in 1/3. So there it is there. And now what you have to do is, so this just is the geometry of the situation. Now you have to ask about the dynamics of the situation. Let's take the idea that the system that is evolved is one that minimizes the amount of energy being dissipated in the system. And so what you have to do is solve for the flow of blood through this network, which means you have to solve for the flow of blood through each tube and then join the tubes up to the network. Well, that's a rather complicated mathematical problem that can be solved, and the way you do it is you write down the equations for the flow of blood through the tube, each tube. You write down the equations for the motion of the tube itself. These are called the Navier-Stokes equations and the Navier equations, respectively. And then you solve those equations. And I'm just showing you that there is mathematics to this. And you can solve it. You solve it for the so-called impedance of the tube, that is the, so to speak, the resistance of the tube to flow. And from that, you then optimize, and this is only for the experts, you optimize it using something called Lagrange multipliers. This is just to show that there is a bunch of mathematics, there's a methodology to this, and that you can solve it. And out of that comes the following. Out of all of that, and that's a large amount of mathematical physics, comes the following. That if you have very small vessels, like you do down at the end of the network, so to speak, then the important thing is literally viscous dissipation, like friction. The friction of pushing blood through thin vessels. And that, it turns out, tells you how radii scale. So how radii scale, and it scales in this way with this 1 over the branching ratio to the 1/3. And if they are big vessels, what you have is where the viscous drag is very small, like in your aorta. The thing that's important is that you have a pulsatile wave, and the thing that you want to minimize is reflections of the wave, and that's called impedance matching. And it turns out you have evolved to match impedances, which means there is no reflection, which is, of course, exactly the way we design our system to send electricity across the country. That's why alternating current is so much better. You can minimize losses, and we have evolved identically to the way we have designed the grid that sends electricity around our country. So here it is, I'm saying it again. So we have the same kind of behavior, this very self-similar behavior that occurs, but now that self-similarity changes due to the nature of the flow, because as the tubes get thinner and thinner, they can no longer support pulsatile flow, and the blood slows down, so that when you prick yourself, blood doesn't gush out, it just trickles out. And the theory gives a complete description of that. And the last thing that the theory says is the total volume of blood, which is the volume of the network, goes linearly with the mass. So it goes linearly, there's M with C is approximately 1 in the theory. And if you put all that together, then what you get is that the flow rate, which is the metabolic rate, goes like this, where this tells you how the volume changes. That's the C, which is 1 in the optimized system. A is how radii scale, and this is how length scales. And we get those space filling and the dynamics again. And when you put all that together, you get this mass to the 3/4. So it just falls out of the theory, a very complicated theory, in terms of mathematics with a very simple result. And this has a bonus that it gives you an overall baseline for the organization and the flow rates, including things like stresses on tubes and so on, for the entire circulatory system as a function of mass. So here are just some data. This is there's lots of data on this for data. This happens to be for a pig. So this is the scaling within an animal. There's also data for human beings. And you can see it's pretty good. And all of these are consistent with these results. I'm not going to bore you with the details. This is for the lengths. This is for the diameters, the radii. And this is for the number of tubes at each level. And that's for the blood volume. And all of these are consistent with that theoretical framework. And that gives rise to this 3/4 law. So it's just showing you that you can put together a serious framework for understanding these scaling laws. And one of the amusing things is that this is the result that you get in D dimensions. If you limit in D dimensions, and you see that the 4 is actually 3 plus 1. And in fact, we've done some, I was involved in actually growing 2-dimensional plants to see if it obeys this. And there is the data was, well, I suppose the conservative statement was not inconsistent with it. So, in some curious way, it's as if life, as I've written down there, it operates in 5 dimensions. There's the 3 space dimensions we live in. There's this one kind of fractal dimension, which is to do with this hierarchy, and then there's time itself. Okay. I will, yes, I think I'll miss this out. I'll just show you, I'll just flash on. There's an enormous number of things one can predict from this, and I'm just flashing this on. You can't read it, you can't absorb it, that's for sure, but I just want to give you a sense that there is a huge number of phenomena that have been measured and can be calculated in this. And what is even more important is that the same principles apply to a completely different evolved engineered system. Plants are quite different, of course, from mammalian circulatory systems. They're fiber bundles. They don't have pulsatile flow. But you apply the same thing. You have to do a whole bunch of different mathematics. You get also all the predictions that I've written down here. And the last thing I want to show you on this is that you can then apply it to an entire forest. And that's what's done here. You can see there's for the individual tree, and there's for the forest, and I'm not going to go through those symbols. The only thing I will say that is beautiful that comes out of this, it turns out that the mathematics of the forest, considered as a system, that is the trees interacting with each other because they have to, the energy that's coming in, both from the ground and from the sun, is allocated between them. That forest has an extraordinary systematic behavior in the same way that the branches of a tree does and the flow of energy through it does. So much so that the mathematics of a forest is identical to that of an individual tree. And that's what these equations say. I don't have time to elaborate on that. All I have time to tell you, and I'm not going to show you much data, I will show you just 2 things. One is something that comes out of that is that the number of plants, the number of trees as a function of the size of the tree should scale as an inverse square law, and there it is. There's some old data from the Malaysian forest, and the nice thing about it is there's 2 different times. There's more data on top of this, which is a 3rd time, and it maintains that same inverse square law, even though lots of individuals have died and new ones have grown up. It's a different forest in terms of individuals, but nevertheless, it maintains that same scaling law. And here I show you only some work that we did last year, which was taking that idea of the forest and putting resource constraints on it and asking if I know the meteorological conditions at any place in the United States, predict the height of the tallest tree. And that's what that is. And the top is, I think, the prediction, and this is the data. You see there's overall good agreement, there's lots of exceptions, but as a baseline of understanding what determines the size of the tallest tree and therefore everything else about the forest, you can do it with this. And what's important about this, it's an analytic model, so you can ask what happens if I change the rainfall, what happens if the temperature goes up, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a good beginning to ask questions about the effects of climate change.
Are you putting in information about the types of species there, or
no? No, you can do it species by as well, but this is not. Okay, let me zip ahead. Let me show you one interesting test of the theory, and that is that the metabolic rate of a cell in this claims to derive the kind of interesting result that the metabolic rate of a cell changes in a different organism. That is the same, take a liver cell, it behaves differently whether it's in a whale, a leopard, or a dog, okay? According to this one mass to the 1/4 law. So here it is, that's this, symbolically, on the log-log plot. But the reason for this is the network. It's the network constraints are constraining it. So there's a prediction. If you remove the network, all those cells, and I put them in a petri dish, I take the cells from all those different animals and grow them in vitro, then they will all migrate to the same value. That's symbolically given by this. And it's a quantitative theory, so you can predict all these numbers. And here's the data, here's the in vivo, the 1/4, and that is that data. The red dots are data we got from ancient papers, but there was a dedicated experiment done, which are the black dots, which is pretty good. Okay, so I think maybe I will miss this part out. Well, let's see. Okay, so I've kind of said this, that the network geometry and dynamics is kind of, it's anti-reductionistic. The functioning of the cell is controlled by the network in this language, and it's controlled in this way that gives to the mass of the 1/4. And it turns out that is since the cell is the fundamental object in a multicellular organism, it determines all rates and times. And in fact, you have to actually work these out for all these various things. And I will go through one or two of them to show that rates do go as mass to the -1/4 and times go as mass to the +1/4. But I've talked about metabolism here top down, but you should also think of metabolism as bottom up, because obviously it's a biochemical process, and it's controlled by biochemistry, the chemical kinetics. And I've symbolically written it down here, the kinetics, it's the concentrations and fluxes and kinetics. And if you go through it all, this part here goes as mass to the 3/4, but of course the kinetics is governed by statistical physics, and there's kind of a Boltzmann factor. And if you put all that together, what it says is that this is really what's going on, that if you put in our temperature to vary, this is the form of the equations, and so it says that something like 90% of the variation is governed by just two parameters. One is 1/4, which I claim comes from the network and is a pure number, and the other is this kind of activation energy in the Boltzmann factor, which is some average limiting rate factor, limiting energy factor for the production, and that number is about 0.7 electron volts in the language I use, so that if you correct it for these two things, you correct it for mass and temperature, everything would be operating at the same rate. They would live and die, and their life histories and their physiology would all adjust to fall on top of one another. And I will show you one version of that in a minute, but I'll show you this. We have a theory, which I'm not going to go into, I'll come back to it shortly, but I won't go into it in any detail, and that is for DNA nucleotide substitution rates, damage caused primarily by metabolism, leading to these substitution rates. And what that said is if you take out the Boltzmann factor and you take that the number of substitutions per site per unit of time, this should scale as the mass to the -1/4, and these are various bits that are labeled here. You can see they're pretty good, even though there's a lot of structure in the data, and vice versa. If you remove the mass to the 1/4, all these should have roughly the same slope. And you can see the data is pretty crappy in a way, but it's very suggestive and certainly not in disagreement with the predictions. Okay. So now I want to flip to something in a little more detail, because I will come back to this later in terms of cities and companies and so on, and that's the question of growth, how growth works in this, and a typical growth curve. And the way it works is, in simple terms, that you, of course, you eat, you metabolize, and that is distributed through networks to maintain networks. There's a maintenance term, replacing dead cells and growing new ones. And so there's the mathematics of it, that's written at the top. First, there's the metabolic rate on the left, the top line, number of cells that are there, times the metabolic rate of each cell, plus the energy needed to create a new cell, times the rate at which you create them. You can add, again, bells and whistles to this. But if you translate that into the overall mass, using the mass of the cell, then you end up with that equation in the middle there, the MDT equation, and it's governed by two parameters, but those parameters are kind of universal in the sense that they transcend individual organisms, like the overall scale of metabolism, the average mass of the cell, and so forth. And furthermore, what you see is that that 3/4 is beaten eventually by the n. So eventually the MDT goes to 0 because n grows faster than n 3/4, and the n to the 3/4, if you trace it back, goes back to the metabolic rate, but the metabolic rate is connected to the number of capillaries. I said that at the very beginning, because as mass to the 3/4, the number of sources to the cells, and the linear term is coming from the number of cells, which goes linearly. So it is that mismatch that is allowing dMdt to go to 0, because if they were the same, you would have open-ended exponential growth. Okay? So that's the way it works, and it has universal parameters. This can be solved straightforwardly. There it is. And then you have universal parameters, and here are fits to various things. There's a fish, 2 mammals, and a bird here, and you can see it's pretty good. And you can rescale all those in a dimensionless form that is given by the theory by plotting m, the mass at time t, at ht versus mass at ht relative to the mature mass, which is calculable for each species, by the way, to the 1/4 power, should be plotted against this variable. T is time, t is age, m is the mature mass, a is one of these universal parameters. To the 1/4. This is a correction that is outside the theory due to birth mass, which has almost no effect. But it says that everybody should grow in the same way. So everything collapses to a single curve, and you can see it's pretty good. And we've done lots more on this. And last year, some people took this model, and I will come back to this later, and applied it to social insect communities. Same thing, same idea. And what they plotted on here is 2 things. They plotted the insect community, as a kind of super-organism, and they've also plotted on here, as you can see, the unitary organisms, the organisms themselves. And you can see there's more fluctuations around the curve, but it's pretty good in terms of kind of getting the sense that there is a kind of background universal curve for growing. Now I want to talk a little bit about the extension to tumors, because that raises some interesting questions as well as some interesting possibilities, because we have the same kind of equation for the tumor. This would be the D sub T is the metabolic rate of the tumor, and it's the same equation, except I put a little V on N because it's the number of viable cells, because we know that there's necrosis in a tumor. And in fact, this theoretical framework, which I'm going to zip through in 2 minutes, predicts, first of all, there should be necrotic tissue, but also the amount of necrotic tissue. And the important thing is to recognize that this is a small network growing on a big network. So there's a host network, you, and then this new thing grows on you. And one of the side questions is to understand the difference between this thing that grows on you, that can kill you, versus the other thing that can grow on you, which is good, namely a baby. And so there's quite a difference, and I won't go into that, but it's one of those interesting questions. But the important thing is, now this metabolic rate depends not just on the size of the tumor, but on the size of the host. And so the calculation is then to redo all of that mathematics with the coupling of two networks. And I'm not going to go into it, but I do want to show you one piece of data. I do want to say that the assumption in this is that actually tumors, since they are us, they obey the same rules. They also try to optimize in some way. A very strong assumption. But then it leads to all kinds of interesting predictions about the tumors. And I'm just flashing these on because it's vessel lengths and diameters, blood flow, and so on. And what you see here is that, to cut it to the chase, actually the tumors, on the average, obey the same kind of rules, except there's much more fluctuation, much more variability. So here's a good example. This is the flow rate versus the vessel diameter within a tumor, and the prediction is that this should be a cubic law. So this slope should be 3, and this is the prediction, and this is the best fit. You can see it's pretty good. Whereas if I had shown you, and maybe I should have done, I showed you earlier some results for healthy tissue, the fits were very tight. So from this viewpoint, the fundamental difference is that on the average they obey the same rules, but there's much greater fluctuations. And I don't have time to talk about the nature of the statistics of those, but they do play a role. The second thing is, for small tumors, I didn't say this and I should have done, that when you do healthy tissue, when you have a macroscopic multicellular organism with a pulsatile system, the pulsatile flow completely dominates because the tubes, most of the blood is in tubes where viscosity plays a minor role, and that's what gives rise to the 3/4 power. If you had a very small mammal, so small that it could not support a pulsatile flow, then the theory tells you it's no longer this 3/4, it's linear. That's what they've written up here. This beta, which was the exponent that gave rise to 3/4 before, now becomes 1, and there's a linear behavior, and this predicts, which is what we see, that tumors should start growing in an exponential fashion, which is different than the way we start growing. And secondly, it predicts tangentially the size of the smallest mammal, because a mammal smaller than the size that can support a pulsatile flow starts to be extraordinarily inefficient, because you are dissipating energy by viscosity in every tube of your network, whereas in mammals that are bigger than that, because of this impedance matching, there is a greater efficiency. So you immediately lose that efficiency once you get too small, and you can predict from that the size of the smallest mammal, which turns out to be just under 2 grams, which is roughly the size of a shrew. Okay, so what happens though, as the tumor grows, it can support pulsatile waves, and this is very important. Instead of growing exponentially, it reaches this 3/4 mark, and it behaves like we do. It grows and then stops. So if you could live long enough, and tumors weren't killing you for other reasons, the tumor would stop growing. And I will show you data. I'm going to skip through this, because this is now the whole theory of that, which I'm not going to show you. I will show you this one thing in passing. This is the prediction for the viable tissue versus the total mass. So this is the prediction of the necrotic part, and it scales less than linearly, meaning that more and more the tumor becomes necrotic. And if it lived long enough, if you lived long enough, so the tumor could live long enough, it would be overwhelmingly necrotic, according to this. But the important point is that from this theory, you have these two regions. One is exponential, which is this straight line, and then it turns over to this this sigmoidal, this S-shaped curve, and stops growing. And there are these different kinds of tumors and the kinds of predictions that this gives for this, and it comes naturally out of the theory, and so on. And so other people, this is from a Harvard group of oncologists, have taken this and done the same kind of thing as we did for rescaling it and showing tumors in a rescaled fashion. Here it is, I'm not going to do it. But here's just to give you a sense of things, we did this for that same curve I showed you for growth of multicellular organisms, but we put on here tumors. And you could barely see any difference. So that there's this, you know, at the average level, the coarse-grained level, tumors in this sense are like little organs growing, and they obey pretty much the same rules, but they have this extraordinary variability, which no doubt plays an important role in what they do. So I'm going to skip this, and I want to move to the other problem, the problem that actually got me into all of this work originally, and that is the problem of aging and death. And I've always been morbidly interested in death, and remain so as I approach it. And I got interested in it because I was getting old, and I was intrigued by the fact that my body was changing, and you know, all the usual stuff. I wasn't able to do all the things I used to be able to do. And I'm now 72 years old, and I'm really interested in it as to what really is going on and why. Not that it can be stopped, obviously, but what are the parameters? So the question is, what are actually the parameters that are determining the fundamental question, what in the fuck sets 100 years as the lifetime? Where now does 100 years come from when you are dealing with molecular processes? How do those molecules know? I don't care if you call them genes, I don't care what you call them. How does it know, they know, quotes, think of it in an anthropocentric way, that you're supposed to die when you're roughly 100 years if you're a human being, and not 1,000 years, or if you were, this were mice, this were a piece of mouse, which it could have well have been, it should have been dead 70 years ago. So where in the hell does that come from? That was the question, actually, that got me involved in all of this work. So, I just want to show you, you realize that each one of these pieces I'm talking about, sadly, is kind of 1 hour lecture, and I apologize that it's all smushed up and so on, but you'll bear with me. Maybe this will be a total ADD failure. I don't know. That's what it feels like. So here's a survival curve for human beings. It's an ancient one. It's just the same today, pretty much. And what you see is, this is the number of survivors, percent of survivors versus age. And what you see, life is getting better all the time. You know, it's very Republican kind of image of the world. Everything's getting better, if you only leave us alone, we'll get better and better. And there it is, and the next one, if this had been up to date, would have gone even higher. And what you see, it's great. And it's moving from something that's roughly exponential to something that is sort of sigmoidal in a slightly different way. But, and this is the crucial point, they all end roughly here. They all end. It doesn't matter how much it's been getting better and how much organic food you eat and how much everybody, you know, around here runs and does exercise, but they never beat the 100-year mark. 127, I think, is this French lady lived to a few years ago. So what determines that? And if you are perverse enough, which many people are, ask the question, what knob can I turn to make this 100, 150, or 200, or 1,000, or 1,000,000? Okay. I'm not going to answer these questions. So, first, you begin dying even before you stop growing, I believe. And here I got this Bob Dylan quote. But here what you see is what's plotted here. This is also an old graph. Percent maximal capacity of various things like maximum breathing capacity, vital capacity. These are all medical terms. All these various things. And what you see is, of course, they improve enormously when you grow. And then beginning about here, when you stop growing, it's a slow, linear decline in age. Okay? That's what we're all going through. All of you are somewhere along that line, roughly linear. Okay? Downhill all the way. So, where am I? I'm here. So listen, I'm at only 60% or 50%. Good, about 30. Okay. And remember, I had this invariance, this scaling law. So here is just a summary of what I just said, actually, pretty much. And this suggests that this invariance, by the way, suggests that if it's a number, a dimensionless number, it's sort of like, it's independent of size, it's sort of like a material question. So think of the following. Take a sheet of metal, I'm probably going to screw this up, take a sheet of metal and you cut it and bend it, and you bend it so that it breaks down the middle. And you count how many times you have to do this. Maybe, whatever it is, 1,000 times. But if you double the size of the sheet, it's probably 1,000 times again, because it's something to do with molecular bonds, not to do with the size of the sheet. Therefore, it is suggestive that this is something to do with damage. It's called tribology for those not engineering background. Wear and tear processes. So the idea is that what is killing you is the very system, or systems that are keeping you alive. Namely, that the systems that are keeping you alive are dissipative, because we saw that, and if they're dissipative and creating entropy, they're damaging. So that's the idea. That's the simplistic idea. And we have a theory. We claim we have a theory that's calculable, so we can calculate all this stuff. The second thing is, so there's kind of this wear and tear, which is, as I've written up there, both physical and biochemical, but they're all networks anyway. They're all the same character of networks. And secondly, I've written down there that this is not necessary for this, but it's important, is that the most critical parts of these networks are the endpoints, are the terminal units, because that's where they interface. So where capillars interface with cells, or the energy transmitted in cells through mitochondria, that's critical, and so forth. So it's endpoints that play a critical role, and I'm going to use this. So the other thing to recognize is there's a trade-off, of course, between the resources you give to repair these mechanisms, because we know we repair ourselves, versus the need to live long enough to have enough children commensurate with your ecological niche. So there it is. So here I'm going to give you a back-of-the-envelope calculation to put these into mathematics, and this is just to give it a simplistic version. So let's suppose there's this amount of power dissipated in a terminal unit. That's an invariant by construction. The number of terminal units goes as mass to the 3/4. Therefore, the total power is just that number times the power dissipated in each one of these terminal units. Suppose each time you do a damage, it costs you an energy delta E. And that number is less than electron volt, because everything is governed by quantum electrodynamics. So you determine, in principle, some average number. So after time t, there have been this number of damages. This is a rate, this is the number of damages. ND delta E is given, number of damages caused is given by solving this equation. Namely that. And the first thing that you see is that the number of damages per unit mass is linear in time. So in that aging sense, this might explain why it is you have this linear decrease, that you're continually degrading in a linear fashion. But that number is bigger you are, the longer it takes. Okay? So this immediately see why if you're bigger, you live longer. And there's actually a feedback loop in this that eventually makes it exponential, which I won't go into. But the important point is it's approximately linear, and there are fewer people per unit mass the bigger you are. So let's assume the following, that you get damages that are enough damages that are unrepaired, and I'll talk about repair in a moment, such that enough come that there is a threshold when a certain fraction of unrepaired damages cause the system no longer to be functional. So this is not to do with illness and so on, although I will relate it to cancer in a moment. So let's assume that, and then you can determine how long it takes for that fraction to occur, and here it is, and I put in parentheses here the parts that are independent of mass, and the parts that are dependent upon mass, the number of cells that you have, and the number of terminal units in the network. And you see, again, if the number of cells, the number of terminal units were the same, they scaled in the same way, everybody would live the same length, no matter independent of the size, whether a small animal or a very large one. But the fact that these are scaled differently, one scales linearly in mass, one scales as mass of the 3/4, the metabolic rate, we have this. So from this you get that the baseline is that lifespan should scale as mass to the 1/4. And I won't have time to go into some numbers, but if you put in some reasonable numbers, you can see why something the size of a human being should live the kind of lifespan we have. And it tells you also the kinds of things that go into determining that. I'm going to just say two things very quickly. One is it tells you also that if you're dependent on temperature, like almost all of life is, that's how lifespan should depend on temperature, and I'll show you some data on that. It also tells you how if you change your metabolic rate, you would change your lifespan, and there it is there, and I will show you data in a minute, and it shows you this, what I said before, it takes longer to reach the same level of decrepitude the bigger you are. Okay. And secondly, and I'm not sure your point, that approximately from this viewpoint, aging is roughly uniform throughout the body. Of course, it isn't precisely, obviously, but roughly because of the space-filling nature of these networks. Okay, so that's just showing you, pardon me, data on lifespan as a function of temperature for a bunch of little creatures. And you can see it's pretty good, and that's actually those lines are in agreement with the prediction of the theory. And this is caloric restriction, this is the percent surviving versus age, and if you do a little calculation, that little theoretical framework is in agreement with this. This is old data. A lot of this data is still controversial, and I'm not going to try to defend it, but that's what it says. Now I'm not going to, can I spend a few more minutes? I've just about done my, we started late. Can I spend a few more minutes? That's up to you, I can stop here actually. Let me just go a little bit. I'm going to miss out sleep, other than to say that it is to do with repair, because the one organ, I'm just going to say this, the one organ that must not degrade as you get older is your brain. Because it does. Mine certainly has. Many of yours probably has. But it has, but it must remain in the following sense, that you're continually damaging yourself and you're processing, and you want to make sure that when you, the next day, you're still the same person. But if you didn't, or the next week, because if enough damages occurred, you would end up not being the same person, and some people end up that way, of course. So, roughly speaking, the number of repairs has to match the number of damages. And I'm not going to go through this, I didn't show you the repair stuff, other than to say that actually allows you to predict the time that you're awake versus the time that you're asleep, because the model would be that you sleep in order to shut down the system and effect repairs, because you can't do it well when you're awake. So that was the idea, and it has all kinds of interesting predictions, and both for the time that you're STS over awake, and you see the data is shitty. It's all over the bloody place, and the prediction is 0.18 for that slope. And if you believe in statistics, even in low R squared, it's surprisingly good. As I said, I don't, but everybody seems to like it. But better is this for the sleep cycle. It predicts this should be 0.18 again, going up instead of down, and the data is much better. Anyway, okay, not belabor this. Cancer, I will miss this out, I think. Because, yeah, it's too late, I'm going to miss this out. Some stuff about paradoxes in cancer. I want to finish up in 5 minutes or so, a little bit about cities and connect it up, because I advertised it in the title. And needless to say, you will not offend me at all if you all walk out. I'll keep talking until no one's So, the first question is, are cities and companies convergent to each other? Are they biological? Are they just a big organism? Is New York a great big whale, Microsoft, an elephant, and so on? And are there any universalities to them? And the question, which I don't think I wrote down here, which I'm very interested in, and will say some trivial thing at the end, is the question as to why it is that cities seem to be, roughly speaking, immortal relative to the scale at which they've been around. Almost no cities ever die. Of course, you can think of counterexamples, but of the hundreds of millions, maybe, of communities that are on this planet, or hundreds of thousands, certainly, almost all of them are still with us. There's only very special cases, relatively speaking, that they die. So the vast majority are there. In contrast to, and this is the important point, all companies die. All companies die, and I will show you, and one of things I'd love to be able to do is, if we're almost there, is to have a theory that predicts when Google and Microsoft are going to go bust, as they will, and going bust, I will come back to and tell you what that means. It has a different meaning in companies than it does for you and me. So the first thing is, this whole theoretical framework is based on networks, and cities and companies, for that matter, are networks. This is obvious. This is a network. This is a transportation network. There's another one, and it's supported by networks. But as I love to quote Shakespeare, because he knows everything, the most important network of a city is its people. This network, the network that we participate in as people, and we're participating in fact right now, interactions between people, and the modularity of those, of that structure, of that organization in terms of families, groups, and physics departments, and universities, and so on, countries. So we participate in that in a kind of hierarchical way. So here I'm just going to flash on data quickly. This was the first data, which was on gas stations, and petrol, because it's done by European colleagues, European colleagues. And you can see it's pretty good scaling. And it's like biology, it's sublinear, less than 1, therefore there's an economy of scale. Bigger the city, the less number of gas stations per capita, and it's pretty much the same wherever you are in Europe. This is just 4 of them, but it turns out everywhere we've looked in the world, it's the same. And that slope of that is not 0.75 like biology, it's roughly 0.85, it's 15% savings. On the other hand, and oh, by the way, when you look at all other infrastructural quantities, things that are kind of analogous to biology, you see the same thing, this economy of scale of about 15% of the exposure. On the other hand, things that are outside of biology, that appeared only when we started communicating with each other and forming communities, so this has only been around on this planet for a few thousand years at best, maybe in the universe, for all we know, is total wages, and this is number of so-called super-creative people coined by an urban economist named Richard Florida. But you see here, it's pretty good, the scaling, and the slopes are now bigger than 1, something that is never seen in biology. The bigger you are, instead of the less per capita, the more per capita. In a systematic way, the bigger you are, the more higher the wages are per capita, the more super creative people like yourselves per capita, to the same degree. This more patents per capita. This slope is very similar to the slope of those lines, about 1.15. Crime, this is crime in Japan, a little bit bigger, but it's also in this range. There's police, tax receipts, construction, debt, all with slopes in this range of about 1.15. And here, just to show you, we have a student put together this graph. This is just for the US. Income, GDP, crime, and patents, all on one graph. And then, of course, we can normalize. And they're all scaled in the same way with this approximate slope of 1.15. And, most importantly, it seems to be true everywhere we've been able to get data. So that means Latin America, Europe, United States, China, Japan, and so forth. Now, here's the thing. So you ask yourself, how can that be? Where in the hell, how can it be that Japanese cities, and Portuguese cities, and American cities all scale in the same way when, you know, they evolve essentially independent of each other? Because it says that the scaling seems to be, on the average, independent of geography, history, and culture. How could that be, especially when, you know, we have this feeling that we're in control of our design of cities and so on, unlike biology. And so you ask yourself, what the hell is common across all of these different cities? And the thing that's common is what Shakespeare said, namely, the commonality is the remarkable fact that cities all have people in them, and people interact in a universal way, roughly speaking, no matter where they are. Meaning that the way we interact one-on-one, the way we form modular structures, are pretty much the same, independent of culture. Meaning, just to put it in perspective, there's nowhere on the planet, there never has been, a culture which has 50 to 60 children in a family. I mean, it may vary from 5 to 10 or something like that. Or, you know, this famous number that is the number of people you can have strong interactions with at any one time. That number is between 4 and 6, people say. And that number is pretty much the same independent of culture. And it is that phenomenon that is being manifested in this. So to test that, we have some work that we did recently, this is now reviewed actually, which is with some colleagues at MIT who had access to cell phone data. The cell phone data is fantastic as a detector, and so what was done with this data was you asked how many, you measure the number of interactions for an average person in a given city. Okay, from looking at the cell phone records and asking for the number of reciprocal calls. So connectivity here means I call you, and sometime within this period, which I think is 6 months for Portugal, which is the data I'm going to show you, you call me at least once. So that's the definition. And then you ask, how does that change with the size of the city? So how does the connectivity of people change with the size of the city? And here it is. This is, I forget which is which. One of the colors is Portugal, and the other color is the United Kingdom. And you see, first of all, they are on top of one another, and secondly, the slope is very similar to the slope of these superlinear scalings that we saw for the socio-economic quantities. And this gives credence to the idea that it is this network that is somehow, the fact that AIDS cases, which requires people to actually interact, scales in the same way as wages, scales in the same way as the number of police or crimes, all of which inculcate human interaction between people. This gives credence to that because here's a proxy for that by a cell phone. So there it is there, just to show you. Okay. So here's the statement in simple language. You double the size of the city. All these quantities, income, wealth, good, bad, and the other patents, number of colleges, creative people, police, crime, age, all increased by 15%, regardless of the city across the globe, and you save 15% on infrastructure. So you could also argue, naively from this point of view, namely this is why cities are so attractive, is that, that most people are not concerned about this bottom part, are attracted by that part. So on an individual level, they're looking for increased buzz of a city, increased wages, increased services, and so on. And on a collective level, we also have this savings of 15%. So that maybe is the dynamic of it. So there's an underlying network, which I don't have time to discuss, and if you read Science this week, Rishi's paper, which I took my name off, is going to, it will tell you some of this. And the point is the following, that I showed in biology a couple of things. I said that sublinear scaling, the 3/4, less than 1, was an economy of scale, which led to the slowing of the pace of life the bigger you get, all governed by the network. That also gave rise to sigmoidal growth, which stops. Here we have the opposite, we have superlinear scaling, it's dominated by social interaction. What does that do? In the network, it has all the opposite effects. It speeds life up the bigger you are. And I'm going to show you this in some whimsical way, the walking speed versus population size. And again, as you can see, it increases, sort of consistent with this. I don't have time to do this, but this is part of the space filling in the network. And this is a little bit of theory, but given that it's so late, I will not go through it. And what it shows is, this is a back of the long version of it, that the thing, when I went back to this, you saw this increased by 15%, and this decreased by 15%. That is no accident, according to this. And the reason is, this is more complicated than biology, because you have infrastructural networks, and you have social networks. Social networks are dominant, the city is the people, but those social interactions, that network is kind of a virtual network. Nevertheless, we are grounded on the city. We have to live on the city, and we have to move and interact via a physical network. So these two networks are not independent. They're coupled, and all that hieroglyphics I wrote down was an attempt to put that into a mathematical form. And when you couple these two networks, and you assume that we've developed cities to be space-filling, like biology, then what you find is that that's what's written here, these two, the deviations from one of the infrastructure, from the socio-economic, have to be the same. Okay. Now, maybe I should finish. I want to do one other thing. We've done a lot of work on diversity, the number of businesses, that's what the universality of businesses in cities, and so on. I'm not going to talk about that. But I do want to finish quickly with this growth, very quickly. Okay. So it's the same growth equation, same idea. You have incoming stuff that supports the city, it goes and maintains the city, or maintains the economy, and then you grow, and that's what that equation is. The only difference is that the driving force, which was the beta up there, was 3/4 for biology, and for here, which is less than 1, in socioeconomic systems, bigger than 1. And the question is, what difference does that make? There's the solution to that equation, and amazingly, even though it's the same equation, if beta is bigger than 1, it's completely different than the solution for bigger, less than 1. And that's what it was for less than 1. It's lovely, everything stops growing. But for bigger than 1, and this incidentally would be very bad for cities and economies because we're supposed to keep growing. So here it is for bigger than 1. When you solve the equation, you have this open-ended growth, which is great. That's what we see. I don't have time to show you data on that, which you're familiar with it. Cities and economies are open-ended, but it has built into it, and this is what I want to finish on, it has built into it something that physicists, mathematicians call a finite time singularity. Somewhere along here, this thing goes to infinity, and that's crazy. So if this is the number or the GDP, it can't go to infinity. Somewhere along the line, it has to stop. And the theory tells you that, and it tells you that if you don't do something before then, the system stagnates and collapses. So the way around that is to innovate, and to recognize that this curve was derived with certain boundary conditions and certain innovative paradigms. It could be you discovered coal, it could be you invented computers, it could be you discovered bronze, I don't know, whatever it is that changes the mindset and the culture. And what it does is allow you to reset the clock and start over again, and you avoid the singularity. So the idea is that to avoid the singularity, you have to keep doing this, because every time you do it, you're going to hit another one, and you better invent something. So that's great. However, and here's the punchline, as you go along here, we already said life has to get faster, and that's difficult enough, and then along here it gets even faster, but this jump between has to come faster and faster. That is, the time between innovations has to get shorter and shorter in a systematic way. And so you're on this treadmill, it's going faster and faster, and you have to jump to another one on a systematic basis, faster and faster. So that's the idea, and the question is that sustainable? Obviously, if you take it ad infinitum, it isn't. And if you do a little calculations in this, we maybe have somewhere between 25 and 50 years before we have to change something, if you believe any of this. It's not a little bit speculative, but there's lots of data that supports it. So that's what I said here, and I will list this out. And I think I'll stop here. I was going to tell you a little bit about businesses, but I won't. But they are different. If anyone's interested, we can talk about it. But what I was trying to show, and I completely mistimed the whole bloody thing, and I've done it with all kinds of bits and pieces, was to try to show you that there is a kind of conceptual framework or paradigm where you can use these scaling ideas in particular as windows onto underlying dynamics, and understand a little bit about the organization of these systems, and a little bit about their evolution and some of their properties. And I just scraped the surface of many of these problems, and there's lots of others. And I'm sorry if I've sort of mixed up many different things, and I'm just sorry I couldn't show you about businesses. Anyway, I'll stop there, and I thank you for being so patient.
Of course, you guys have to head off. It's understandable. And if anybody has any questions, we have time for a couple.
Yeah, I'll show you some slides. Okay, I'll show you some slides. And this is a little unfair. I didn't give you the whole. This slide is unfair, but it was done because I knew that I thought I'd have 5 minutes. So I didn't show you the complete data. This is the earliest data. Yes. So what one is each one assets versus number of employees. Okay. And you can see it scales very well. I should tell you that these have been binned. You know what I mean? You know, we've binned certain things, but it doesn't matter. You get the idea. I could show you the complete data set. The data set that we ultimately use is 29,600 US publicly traded companies with data on. And I'm trying to tell you a summary of analysis of that set of data. And I'm showing you just one tiny bit, because it's the important bit for this. They scale. There's junk at the beginning, but you see this is logarithmic, so this is less than 100 employees. These are quite small. These are all the big ones and the ones you're used to. And they scale, but you notice that the slopes of these are less than 1. They're not like cities, they're not bigger you are, you don't get more, actually you get less. And so, without, because I don't have time to tell you, but this leads, if you naively took what I talked about, this would lead, instead of open-ended growth, which is what businesses want and what they project, and I will go back. Where was it? Yes. There. This is the image of businesses. In fact, these are all the people around you. This is all Silicon Valley companies making tons of money. Okay? That's the idea. That's what it should look like. If you believe this sublinear, well, you believe that's the data. The data says it's sublinear. So let me go zipping ahead again. Back to here. Oops. Sublinear. Then things should stop growing. eventually, okay? And they should die. That's the idea, roughly. And so here's something I did. This is a little bit hooky, frankly. It's fun. So there's Walmart, okay, growing like a hockey stick. But you see it ends in 1994. And if you add in to more recently, that's what it is. And that red line is from that theory. And there it is. And you can see Walmart will gradually bend over. And if you think that that is, it happens to be a particularly good case. I should definitely tell you that. However, this is all 29,000. 29,000, that's just a spaghetti plot, but it's plotted just in real time. And what you see here, if you absorb it, is that there are all these, at every point, there's these companies zooming along. But look, everybody ends up flattening out and so on. And I don't know if I put in, no, I didn't put in the, but what I did do, and I have much better ones than this, and I'm sorry I didn't change it, we've just completed a paper on the mortality of companies. And what is plotted here is, I showed you for human beings survival, this is mortality. So it's the inverse, okay? So this is the percentage of companies, 0 to 1, 0 to 100, dying, and you see everybody ends up flattening and dying. This whole thing of none left. So we've done a very detailed, quite sophisticated mortality analysis. It's called survival analysis. There's a whole statistics of it. We've done it. This was not done this way, but we've done all that just to make sure the I's are dotted and the T's crossed. And the answer is, roughly speaking, that, and we've done it with this data set, 29,000 companies, covering from about 1950 to now. Incidentally, as with the city stuff, very hard to get good data. But the half-life of a typical US publicly traded company is a little less than 10 years. And you have to recognize these are already companies that are on the stock exchange. So they've gone through gestation, they've already some success, and they can last maybe 10 years. 1 second. We've also done, there are certainly, we've looked at certain, there's outliers, of course, that live beyond some of that. And the most famous example, and all of these, incidentally, the ones that are super long, hundreds of years, that are way out on the tail, are typically ones in very specialized sectors, the wineries, or things of that nature, restaurants. Banking, there are a couple banking, there's a Germany, but the longest company on record is a Japanese company. Founded in something like 587. And here's what's amazing. It died 2 years ago. Now, I first, before asking you the question, what do you think that company did? I should have said earlier what we mean by death. So what we mean by birth, in statistics I'm talking about, is you've gone on the stock exchange. So this is no private, it's all publicly traded companies. And they're already on the stock exchange. Secondly, death is when they report no more sales. Finished. Now here's an interesting thing. We looked at what are the percentage of companies that have died by that definition, that have gone bust completely. Bankrupt, liquidated, and so on. I made these numbers slightly wrong. It's of the order of 12%. Actually completely disappeared. There are about 30% where it's not reported. You don't know what happened to them. But just over 50%, maybe it's just under 50%, 47% were merged or swallowed up by another company. Okay, so we define that first of all as death. But I think on this graph, yes, you can see it is. We've separated the two. It doesn't make any difference to their longevities. Their half-lives are slightly different, but you can see the form of the mortality curve is pretty much the same. And I really apologize, I had the updated version of this, I forgot to put it in. So we've done quite a bit of work on that, and there's a paper on this mortality that is just finishing, draft is just finishing. So that's my quick, this is something I like to show you that you can read it. This is that, our metabolic rate as human beings, as biology, which is what we all had up till 10,000 years ago, is 100 watts. We're light models in here. But if you ask what is our social metabolic rate, that is, what are we as social organisms living in cities, electricity, cars, and other stuff, that number is 11,000 watts. And what this has done is turn that around and ask what size animal operates at 11,000 watts. Instead of being, whatever we are, 150 or so pounds, we're a 30,000 kilogram gorilla, which I worked out to be about 1,000 elephants. So my concern is each person in the developed world is equivalent to one of these. There are 7 billion people on this planet, and within their own cultural norms, they all want to be like this. They want to be like us. That's my own assessment. I mean, they may have different cultural forms of it, but they all want to operate at 11,000 watts. And there are 3 billion more coming on board in the next 30 years who also want to operate at that level. And we have to do this faster and faster. Well, this is the only time in my life that it's good to be old. I can tell you that. The only sad thing is I have children whom I love dearly, and it's terrible to think what young people will have to face, in my opinion. And, so anyway, this is just a metric for it, and I don't know if I'm going to, I don't know. So I'm sorry, that's my answer to your question, longer than I intended.
Okay. Probably wrap it up. Maybe one more question.
He's been jumping a bit.
Isn't the half-life of companies decreasing, and then also when is food going to die?
Yeah, I don't know about it. I don't know, because we haven't done enough. I don't know. Dying, that's why he was very careful. Dying may mean that it gets, it may be that Yahoo buys up Google. And there'll be some poetic justice there. I should say this, I was so tired. I said some of these words to Larry Page, who no longer speaks to me. By simply asking the question, when all companies die, when do you think Google will die? And he was very pissed off. That's silly in a way, because you're going to die. It's a fact, and it's good to know why. Isn't it good to know that there might, if you have cancer, it's going to kill you. That's very important to know that. Or if you get pneumonia at my age, it's very dangerous. It's good to know that. So I was that only confirmed, frankly, my prediction. If you see what I mean. Yeah.
I'm just dying to see your last 3 slides.
Oh, Jesus Christ. Well, these are not mine. These are, okay. Well, you're gluttons for punishment. This is not mine at all. This is from Ray Kurzweil, who somehow got passionate about this idea of the singularity. And in my mind, I think he's interpreted it correctly. I first thought he didn't, but I think he has, sort of correctly, that it's a phase transition, it's a transition to something new. I completely disagree with what the newness will be. I could interpret it completely differently. I think it's terribly misleading. But that's, that's an opinion. But what he did is he put together a bunch of data. So here's what's plotted, is the paradigm shift time. So how long it took for something to happen, how long it took for, some major paradigm shift, versus how long ago it happened. So a very long time ago, a billion years ago, it took nearly 1 billion years to make cells, and so on. That's the idea. Now, I don't like this, what he did. I don't like biology. Well, I like this. just the bit I like, this bit at the bottom. You see all these things piling up. And it turns out this slope is predicted by our theory. And it's what is in the theory. That slope of that, that's why I showed that. And similarly, what is this? This guy, I don't know, I just happened to find this on the web, and it's very similar, and it kind of corresponds to the kind, I mean, I don't know if these are, we should use these in the way he's done it, but it's in terms of image, it says what it's doing. And the last thing, well, I think I showed this at the same when I talked in the physics department, is, I don't know if people will remember who John von Neumann is, but he's a great mathematical physicist. And this amazing quote from the 50s, and this is a long time ago that he made this statement, and I don't know where he, what was going on in his head, but this is really, in the essential singularity is a special term rather than mathematical, and this actually does have such an essential singularity. So there it is, and I'm afraid, sadly, I kind of agree with that, not frankly because we can't get out of it. I think we can find ways within this to get out of it. Not to vote one of them, but I think there are ways, certainly ways of dealing with it. The problem is twofold. One is we haven't left ourselves enough time, which has been done starting 50, 75 years ago, and especially when we're already drawing attention to these problems. But associated with that is the fact that we have no political leadership anywhere. I don't see any. I think we have everywhere around the world. We have to have a particularly weak president, but that's true around the globe. And cares. Al Gore kind of cares, but he's focused only on global warming, which is good. I think it needs the whole thing. So I coined a phrase which is called, we need a grand unified theory of sustainability, meaning we need the whole, everything needs to be in it. And maybe something will happen eventually, but I just don't see that there's time, sadly. I hope I'm completely wrong, to tell you the truth. That the numbers here aren't correct. So anyway, on this terrible note, sorry about that.